Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
And we are with the Educators School Safety Network. We are a national nonprofit organization, and we provide school safety training and resources and technical assistance. And we primarily work directly with schools and school districts. But one of the things that we do as a nonprofit is resources like this that are available for free. So we'll dive right into it and do a little bit of an overview of who we are in case you haven't heard any of our other previous webinars, and then we'll get right into the content. Anything you want to say before we start?
No, this is webinar number 5, so you missed 4 of them. Go back and get them. But webinar number 5, we're forging ahead in 2020.
Good. And I'm glad that you sort of omitted your Mambo number 5 joke, because as you were concerned, it is quite dated. So,
but it would have been funny had I said
it. So looking forward and looking back, part 2 indicates there's a part 1, which there is. If you wanted to see the original webinar where we talked about our research from the 1920 school year,
now the 1819
the previous full school year, I would encourage you to check that out. You can go to our website, www.eschoolsafety.org, and click on violence, and you can read the report. And if you click around on our website, you'll be able to find that previous webinar pretty easily. As I said before, we are a national nonprofit organization, and we provide school safety training and resources and professional development from an educational perspective. And that's really informative in all of the work that we do. We are not law enforcement professionals. Dr. Klinger up there has 30 years of experience in public education as a teacher, as an administrator. And so we are trying to translate this work of school safety through that educational leadership or instructional educator lens, because there really just isn't a lot of resources looking at this issue from that standpoint. As I said, Dr. Klinger above has 30 years of experience in public education. She's also my mom, so when you get confused, why do we have basically the same name? I guess you can blame her for that.
But I am wearing a different suit jacket, so that's
nice.
Good.
Do you want to add anything about your information, or?
No, I think it's important to come to this work as a practitioner and as a career educator.
And I am Amanda Klinger. As you see from the Esquire there, I am an attorney by training. I try not to get too deep in the weeds with any of the legal stuff, although sometimes you ask me questions and I have to respond with some of my legal training and make sure all those student loans are getting put to good use. So I do sort of come at this work from a little bit of a different perspective, but it's an important one that can inform decisions that you make as educators and as leaders. What we do speak a lot at conferences. We try to primarily spend most of our time doing direct training for educators, professional development, again, from that perspective that you don't hear from all that much. And then we do a lot of, as I said, resources like this that are available, hopefully usually for free on our website. So what we are talking about today is our research project that we've had ongoing for a long time, and we've published our full report of the previous school year, the 1819 school year. That's published, but what we're going to talk about today specifically is sort of an informal look at our mid-year findings. What did we find when we were analyzing just the fall of 19, the part of the school year that just ended? And so we're going to talk about, is there anything that's different from 1819? How, of the research of what we're seeing, what does that mean for us as practitioners in the classroom, and how can that inform our professional practice?
Well, so for all you math folks out there and you stats geeks out there, keep in mind that this is not as exact of a science as it might be, because when you consider the end of fall and is there information that comes out afterwards. And so you just have to give us a little bit of a standard error of measurement here that's a little bit generous in terms of looking at these statistics. So we're giving you hard numbers, but it's really more about what these trends kind of suggest. And so I think probably one of the first big takeaways is when we looked at what we tracked in 1819, and when we looked at school shootings, because clearly that is sort of the ubiquitous thing that everyone thinks of when they talk about school safety. So when you looked at actual shooting events in schools in 1819, it was about 6% of all the violent incidents that we tracked. And in the fall of 2019, we saw that trend being very much the case. A little bit down, it was about less than 5%. And again, if you go back and look historically in the times that we've been doing this, they tend to, it tends to run less than 10%. So clearly, and we're going to talk about this, 6%, 5%, 4%, whatever that percent is, clearly is unacceptable and should never be occurring. But we have to also put it in its proper context to have a conversation about school safety that places school shootings in both their critical importance, their critical threat, but also in the proper context of what we should be doing and how we should be approaching them.
And you mentioned that this is not a big change. 6%, 5%. This is not different than what we've seen since the genesis of when we started doing this research. However, if you're just joining us today for the very first time, this is going to seem very shocking to you because the prevailing narrative in the media and in the culture is that school safety equals active shooters. That is the most likely threat. It's happening all the time. We speak with people in an international context, and teachers from other countries who are thinking about coming here to teach internationally. That is a top of mind concern, as if stepping foot in American school means you're probably going to get shot. And so, as you said, we obviously, one school shooting is unacceptable. And so we have to hold in our mind these twin aims. On one hand, we have to work to prevent school shootings because it's unacceptable. But on the other hand, we have to put them in their proper context of how likely of a threat is that really, and how often are they really happening.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about the percent of incidents. It's not that there's 5 of them or 6 of them. It's the percent of incidents. Mm-hmm. So it's a very small percent of incidents. And as Amanda, as you said, people believe that 50 or 60 or 75% of any bad things that happen in a school are related to a school shooting, when in actuality, there are many other types of incidents that are occurring in schools that are not school shootings. And so when we look at incidents where shots were fired, they're not the most common. They're less than 8%. Even if you lump in an actual school shooting or where shots were fired or accidentally discharged or whatever it might be, that's not the most common thing that is disrupting our schools and traumatizing kids and creating an unsafe environment. It's actually false reports. And again, that was true in 1819, and it's true in the fall of 19, where we have this incredible rate, 36% of all incidents are someone believing that something is happening, either intentionally calling in an active shooter or saying that there's an active shooter event because of the chaos and then what they know will ensue, or someone who believes that they're witnessing or hearing something or seeing something that indicates that there is an active shooter. And do you want to speak a little bit about that? Because we talked about that a little bit in the context of our 1819 of, what is that really, what does that mean that you have this high rate of false reports?
Well, I mean, there's sort of the question of like what's causing it, and that's very difficult to unpack and speculative and not really as important as the question of like, there is an impact, there is a cost to students. Obviously, there is a emotional, psychological cost to kids that we are responding to all these things. And it's important, we say it's a false report, and we sort of...
Which is not a threat, and it's important to clarify
right,
that.
And we sort of, after the fact, go, false report, no one was hurt. At the time that happened, they did not know it was a false report. They were responding as though there was someone abducting children. They were responding as though there was a bomb. They were responding as though there was an active shooter. And so, I mean, I don't know if you live in a place where they test, the tornado sirens. For the first couple seconds that goes off before you realize, it's noon on a Tuesday, you are responding for a couple seconds at least, as if it's the real thing. And then you go, oh, right, this was a test. Oh, wonderful, that was a false report. No one was actually in danger. And we cannot discount the period of time that people are responding. They are evacuating kids. They are responding. And then it turns out it was a false report. And so I think we can't understate the severity of the consequences, even when there is no physical injury, there is no damage, there is no threat.
But I do think it speaks a little bit, or at least it suggests a little bit, the pervasiveness that you alluded to earlier of, if I see something unusual happening in a school, my mind immediately goes to it's an active shooter, as opposed to it might be something else. So it really speaks to that. It speaks to that anxiety, that level that we have, that belief that we have that this is something that is imminently going to happen in a school at any moment. And then there also is that sort of weaponizing that we talked about in the fall, of, somebody that wants to create chaos, fear, disruption, anxiety. They want to, to strike back at the school. They're able to create that at a very low level by just saying, I saw someone with a gun, or there's an active shooter happening. And a lot of these false 911 calls and those sort of things are where we're weaponizing that fear against us. And I think it's really an interesting dichotomy that, when we started doing this work in 2008 or even earlier, it was hard to get people to overcome the bias of, well, that won't happen here.
Yeah.
And there still is that to a large extent. But yet at the same moment, there's these two very oppositional things happening. There is kind of this belief that that would never happen here, but whoa, is that happening here?
Yeah.
And it's very strange. Those two opposing things are coexisting in many people.
It's almost like there's the belief it won't happen here, and also the belief that it is definitely an active shooter. Some sort of distress, some sort of disruption is definitely an active shooter. And I think it sort of speaks to the lack of preparation and the lack of tools that people have been given for any other type of response. That sort of old adage, if you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If the only tool and the only response procedure that you as an educator in your school have been given is how to respond to an active shooter event, then any type of disturbance, any type of concern, at least in the beginning, at the very beginning of the concern or the crisis, everything probably is an active shooter, because that's the only thing I've been trained or equipped or prepared to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask 10 people, educators, teachers, parents, if you ask 10 people, what do you worry about? What's your big fear for school safety? They're all going to say active shooter. Nobody's going to say, I'm worried that a non-custodial parent will come in and snatch a kid out of my classroom, or I'm worried that one of my students will get killed by a bus in the parking lot. They don't worry about those things. Or I worry that someone's going to have a cardiac arrest and I'm not going to know what to do. They worry about this least likely scenario, while at the same moment often believing that that would never happen in their school. So it's a very complex kind of dynamic there.
Yeah. The other thing I want to clarify just really quickly before we move on, when we're talking about these percentages, 8%, less than 8% of incidents involved shots being fired in an active shooter. And you kind of alluded to this in your discussion, and we probably need to make a graphic of this. It's of what we're studying. We're studying violent threats and incidents in schools. So we're only studying violence. So of what we're studying, the smaller concentric circle inside that is incidents, and then the tiny 8% is incidents involving a shooting or shots fired or an active shooter event. So outside even of the realm of what we're even studying is all of the crisis events that don't involve violence.
Yeah, if you had a means to be able to aggregate all the weather-related things, all of the accidents, all of the things that happen just as the function of putting 1,000 kids together in a building.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And we're going to talk a little bit about all hazards later on in this webinar, but I think it's really important to remember this 8% is a tiny 8% sliver of just this one part of the concern that we're studying in this research.
Not even the big picture overall. Someday when we get omniscient ability to look at everything, we'll figure out how to do that. But right now, that's beyond our scope. So within looking at these violent incidents, just incidents of violence, you can see there that comparison between what we found in the totality of the 18-19 school year and just in the fall of 19. So again, false reports and suspicious persons and that fear and anxiety of what might be happening tops the list. Actually a little bit higher in the fall, although I don't think that's anything super significant, but it is the most common. Gun incidents, again, and this is where guns are found in schools, where someone has brought a gun to school, where someone has actually discharged a gun in school or has committed a school shooting. All of those lumped together is 24%, 28% respectively, but there is a significant percentage of that is someone bringing a gun to school. So it's not just actually a shooting, but it's some sort of incident where a gun makes its way into the school. And then violent and aggressive behavior, which was kind of a little bit of a blip in the 18-19 school year, that we had this increase in student and parent or outsider violent, aggressive behavior that did not rise to the level of a shooting, did not use a gun, but instead was some sort of physical attack or some sort of acting out that was beyond the scope of a kid getting mad and, pounding the desk, or it was beyond the scope. It required law enforcement or other outside intervention. And so we saw a pretty steep increase in the 18-19 school year. And again, I'm not sure what that indicates, but again, we see that as being an issue, a continued issue in the fall of 19. And anecdotally, it's very interesting in the conversations, go back just for a second, in the conversations that we have with teachers, we hear that anecdotally a lot, that they are concerned about assaults, about students actively attacking them, attacking each other, this violent, aggressive behavior. So I think that bears watching and some conversation. And then finally, the thwarted plots was 13% in 18-19 and was 19% or 6% in the fall of 19. Again, one of the ones that we watch where people are finding out that there was an actual plan of attack for a school. So, okay. So when we compare the fall of 17, 18, and 19, you can sort of see the threats, the incidents, the threats, and then the total numbers. And you can kind of see these sort of peaks and valleys that we tend to see over time. And you really have to look at the fall of 18 and go, wow, what was happening in the fall of 18? Well, we were coming off of the devastating shooting at Parkland. And we have seen in our research that when you have a big event that galvanizes public opinion and people are very interested in it, and there's lots of repercussions and it's awful and horrific and terrible, that does tend to create that echo chamber sort of effect. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of research where you talk about suicide contagion, and I think a lot of that thinking can really be applied to this, especially when you're looking at threats. Obviously the number of incidents jumped, was a little bit of a spike in 2018 as well, but it's really a big jump in threats, and that's people looking at what happened, and it's being covered so broadly in the news, and just think of the domino effect of a big, high profile tragic shooting. There's a lot of media coverage, people start doing stuff, we have more drills, we have more discussion,
people are more anxious,
we institute more security interventions, security law enforcement type interventions, and it is natural to indicate that we would have higher threats as a result. And then also we have higher reporting. I mean, there is a inherent problem in the data collection of this, of people are reporting incidents that were lower level that they wouldn't have reported before something like Parkland, or their threats are making it out into the public consciousness when maybe the same number of threats were happening before, and just people are now reporting things because of that heightened anxiety and that heightened attention on it.
But I think there's two takeaways from this slide. One is that regardless of whether you have an event that has happened or not, you are going to have incidents and you are going to have threats. And so it's this ongoing sort of thing. The question is what level and what severity and how much of an impact it has, but it is not something that was a one and done, that, oh, well, now everything's died down and we don't have these anymore. It is an ongoing concern. And then we also can see the ripple effect of when you do have a larger, more tragic incident, that it doesn't just impact one school in Florida, it impacts all schools.
Yeah. So this always speaks to this dichotomy, and if you've heard some of our other webinars and some of the other things we've talked about, that school safety isn't just about active shooter response, but our school safety trainings and the things that we undertake and the legislation that's passed almost always is. And so that is that distinction between what is the prevailing narrative, what is the prevailing feeling. I feel like school shootings are the most pressing, most prevalent, most problematic concern, and what does that actually bear out in terms of numbers, in terms of actual risk, in terms of things that are happening. So you want to
let me add something to that, because we have had people say to us, well, so are you saying that an active shooter is not a tragedy? That's not what we're saying at all. But it's equally dangerous to ignore all of the other things that are injuring kids, killing kids, or impacting kids in schools because of our empathy and our horror and our dismay at a school shooting. So it's really important for us to continually bring that up of, yes, we need to be concerned with active shooter, but our concern is not to say, well, active shooter, not that bad.
Sure.
That's not at all what we're saying. What we're saying is there are other equally tragic and dangerous things happening in schools that are being ignored because of our fixation on one particular event.
Sure.
You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I think that's important, and we always try to repeat that obviously one school shooting is unacceptable, one school shooting is a tragedy, but sort of like think about it from a public health standpoint. From a public health standpoint, what is the leading cause of death in this country? I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think suicide, for example, is a very, very high one. Does that mean that as a result we're going to stop wearing sunscreen, and we're going to stop wearing seatbelts, and we're going to stop teaching our kids how to stop, drop, and roll, and we're going to stop teaching kids how to get out of this house if it was on fire? No, just because those are maybe not as high profile or maybe not as high risk, we still need to, from a public health standpoint, we need to be concerned about all those things, and we need to be working on all those things. It doesn't mean we're going to start smoking again, because suicide is actually more of a cause of death. And again, I don't know that for sure, but
no, but I think you raise a valid point of there is a little bit of this mystifyingness of suicide, of how can that happen? And that same thing occurs in an active shooter event in a school. How did this happen? How could anyone do this? Mm-hmm. And so I think that elevates it to a higher level of horror, where we can say, well, clearly, this person smoked, or they ate unhealthy, or they were overweight, and we can see sort of a cause there. Mm-hmm. But I think that, I think that's a valid point, is that we've got to give equal weight to all of these sort of things that are causing potential safety concerns in our schools. And so what we want to talk about next is to just take a little bit of a conversation about, so the focus, the money, the initiatives that are related to active shooter continues, which is good, but we don't have that same level of time, attention, focus, money, initiatives related to other school safety concerns that are also causing devastation. So I wanted to talk very briefly about the legislation that is making its way through many states that requires panic alarms. There are 2 House bills at the federal level that are awaiting action that would mandate that schools install panic alarms or duress alarms. You'll hear them called a variety of different things. Several states have enacted requirements where schools must install panic alarms, duress alarms. Louisiana at a cost of $4 million, which is just their preliminary allocation, not exactly how much it would cost.
And that's for apps, not physical buttons.
Yes. In Oklahoma, $3 million. New Jersey has signed it into law. And you see a lot of momentum for this based on Parkland and based on the devastation and the tragedy there, which absolutely we can understand where folks are coming from in their desire to advocate for this. Florida is considering it. It would cost around $8 million. New York is considering it. And so we are not saying, oh, this is a terrible idea, we shouldn't do it. We're asking to consider some points about panic alarms, and probably the most significant of them is this is not a feel-good measure that we spend $8 million and put in panic alarms. All kids are safe. We can go home, do something else, and don't have to worry about it because school safety is solved because we installed panic alarms. Clearly, that is not the case. But there's some other points to consider about panic alarm legislation.
It's important. You said it's not a feel-good measure. It is a feel-good measure. It's not a silver bullet.
Should not be a feel-good measure.
It is not a solution. It is not a foolproof way to say all kids are magically safe now because of this panic button. And I think the really tragic reality to think about is if there is a school shooting event, a panic button will bring you help faster, but there will still be fatalities at the beginning of that event. And so we need to make sure that we have really clear eyes of what does a panic alarm accomplish and what can a panic alarm not accomplish.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Go ahead with the single case use. I think that's a critical point.
Well, so I think it's important that a panic alarm, like a lot of these other security interventions that are meant to stop school shootings, only can help in that thing. A panic alarm does not help you if we have a tornado. We talked in our last episode of the live stream about this crazy, I think it wasn't technically a tornado, but this wild weather event that ripped off half of the gym while kids were playing in the gym. Panic alarm, not going to help you with that. A panic alarm is not going to help you if you have other types of risks and hazards. And I think that stems from the issue that what does it mean when you've pressed the panic alarm? Because either a panic alarm means bring law enforcement, lights and sirens, we have an active shooter, or the panic alarm means, I don't know, something bad is happening, let's talk about it more.
Yeah, and that's really my concern with the panic alarm situation is clearly there, whether there would be training involved or not, clearly there is an impact on our communication system. So if I have a panic alarm at my desk in my classroom and I have a student that throws up and collapses and I press the panic alarm, I am not giving anyone clear information about what the response needs to be or what kind of assistance I need. Mm-hmm. So the kid collapses, I press the panic alarm, the default position is there's an active shooter going on in room 22, as opposed to I have a medical emergency, I need an EMT, I need the school nurse, I need 911 called, whatever it might be. And so my concern with the panic alarms is that in many ways, it's your hammer and nail analogy. It's treating everything as I need law enforcement, lights and sirens. And I do worry about the implications of people storming into the building, believing that they are responding to an active shooter event, when in reality, you have a kid that's, in a cardiac arrest on the floor of the classroom. Mm-hmm. And how long have we delayed an appropriate response because we have treated it in a different way based on this panic alarm? And I understand maybe that wouldn't happen and maybe you can do training, but that certainly is a consideration.
Well, but a panic alarm is only really helpful when it's a communications shortcut or a communications shorthand. So instead of me calling the office, whether it's with my cell phone, with the classroom phone, with the PA, with the student running a note, I'm initiating contact with someone outside of my classroom to say, I need this type of help. Well, a panic alarm is only helpful if I can shortcut that process, which one button press communicates the information that I need it to communicate. Well,
I mean, a panic alarm is a scream, essentially, with no information. It's just a panic scream.
Mm-hmm. And you have to decide ahead of time, what is my panic button press shorthand for? And if we're ostensibly trying to mitigate the effects of an active shooter, my panic button, my screen means active shooter, an active shooter here. And if that's the case, then the button is not useful for any other types of events.
And it is useful for that event, but at what cost if it's used inappropriately? And at what cost if we're not using it for anything else, if that's the only thing we're using it for? And that panic button may be in your classroom for, hopefully for forever and never gets pressed, which is great. But at a cost of $8 million, I guess that raises the next thing of, is there a different way that we could spend the allocation of these funds that would maybe speak to prevention of active shooter events or other kinds of violence, that would maybe speak to all hazards sort of approach? Is there a way that we can improve a communication system or implement a communication system that works for all types of events rather than a single use case?
Yeah. And then I guess the sort of last sort of uncomfortable question that we're not really going to dive deep into, but just to ask you to consider, who benefits from a requirement like this? Ostensibly, on its face, students are supposed to benefit, but after all of the concerns that we've just raised, maybe reflect on, are there other folks who stand to benefit from a requirement like this? Especially when the allocation of funds is not for something that has a lot of evidence to support its efficacy. When we talk about threat assessment and management, for example, a way to prevent violence in schools, and if this is the first time you've heard someone say threat assessment and management, please pause this webinar, go find the research and the information on our website about this, about something that has a mountain of evidence to support its efficacy. Something like a panic button does not have evidence to support its efficacy to prevent violence and has very minimal evidence to support its efficacy to mitigate the impacts of a violent event. So then the question is, who benefits from a requirement like this?
Well, and so two quick subpoints to that. One is, if you go back and look at some of our webinars where we've discussed the lobbying and the security industry and the amount of money that people that are selling hardware are making, and if you look at where a lot of the funding is going and where a lot of the grants that are tied to purchasing hardware and who's behind pushing that legislation, it unfortunately is oftentimes people, for-profit entities who are selling this magical thing, who are making a lot of money, who are advocating for it, who are creating a false sense of efficacy or creating a notion that this is the thing that will fix things without any research to back that up or any practical application to back that up. And the second part, which is even more uncomfortable, and it's clearly very uncomfortable for us, is to look at or to look in the face of someone who has been impacted by these tragedies and say no. I mean, who can say if someone, if someone has had that tragedy and says, this is the thing that I think will help to prevent this tragedy, it's very difficult to go, no, I don't think so. I think we need to do this because of the pure, the empathy and the regard that we hold those folks in. So I think that's really difficult too, that we have to do something clearly, but we can't necessarily always have it be tied to something quick, something that feels good, something that seems, easily implemented. And so that's a very difficult conversation to have in the whole entire realm of school safety.
Yeah. So we're going to shift a little bit and talk about what we've seen as developments more recently in active shooter drills.
Oh, yes, the good old surprise drill. And that is something that we clearly saw coming more and more in the wake of Parkland in the 18-19 school year and in the fall of 19, where we have these devastating active shooter drills or active shooter trainings that are very focused on the element of surprise, the element of realism, the element of putting you through your paces so that you understand. And you've heard us talk a lot about the one in Indiana where they were, shooting at the teachers with airsoft guns, execution style. We've talked about that a lot because it's kind of the most extreme. But we also need to focus on a more lower level concern. And I'm using the example here in Bentonville schools in Arkansas, just because this just came out last week. They were talking about they have 4 lockdown drills a year. The first one is announced and the rest of them are surprise. So I'm wondering aloud how we define surprise. And the school spokesperson, you can see the quote there, once we get to the second or third drill, we don't announce those in advance to the building staff so that we can watch for anything that can be corrected. And in the context of this discussion, you had a lot of parents verbalizing concerns about the trauma of kids thinking there was an active shooter when in reality it's quote unquote just a drill. And so it really raises the question of when we do these surprise drills, do we mean surprise as in, I'm not telling you that in 3 weeks we're going to do an active shooter drill. And then on the day of, I say, okay, guys, we're going to do an active shooter drill. It's just a drill, but we're doing an active shooter drill. Fine. But oftentimes what we see is where people are saying, there's an active shooter, and then they're watching what everyone does. And so those are two very different kind of scenarios, one of which is probably a good practice, and one of which is a terrible idea.
Yeah, and I think, there's a number of reasons, and I will put on my lawyer hat for just a second. Can you imagine the amount of liability on your school district if a student runs, hides, or fights because they think it's a real drill? So you have a student jumping out of a window and injuring themselves because you have announced we have an active shooter in the east wing of the building, and you don't say it's a drill. Obviously, the liability is huge. And then to get to more of the human cost.
Well, wait, let me interrupt you for a second. You don't have to imagine that because there has been significant litigation in the wake of that. People that had a heart attack because they thought there was an active shooter, people that were injured in car accidents, rushing to the scene. I mean, so yeah, it clearly has happened.
Yeah. And so again, it's this really subtle distinction of the surprise element of we're not going to say ahead of time when the drill is. There's a lot of value in that. And there is a lot of value in people not, okay, well, we're going to end class 3 minutes early because we have our active shooter drill, but that we really are practicing in a non-typical time, that we are practicing in a way that's realistic of what's normally happening in a school day. And there is a lot of value in that. But again, to reiterate what you had said, the very first part of the drill is to say, this is a drill. Surprise, you didn't know it was happening at this time. This is a drill. And then we do it, and we can still do it realistically, and we can still have a real practice. But under no circumstances is it ever appropriate to not announce at the very beginning that is it a drill, and it has to be
And
repeated.
to have people believe that there is an active shooter is the height of malpractice.
And the drill needs to, and the communication that this is a drill needs to be repeated. We know that communication systems in schools are not perfect. And so it cannot just be that you emailed the teachers and said, this is a drill, but then you get on the PA and said, hey, holy cow, we have an active shooter. Because what if you have kids that are cutting class, hanging out in the bathroom, and all they hear is, we have an active shooter. And so that communication that it is a drill needs to be really clear and repeated.
I do think anecdotally, it's interesting in our work that the more you have someone who is super dedicated to a surprise drill that's super realistic and graphic, and those organizations tend to have the least amount of training for folks. And so it always strikes me as, why are we spending so much time making sure that we scare our folks or proving that our folks don't know what to do, as opposed to instead the inverse of investing in our folks so that they do know what to do. And then eventually getting to the point where we drill. And we've, in our podcasts and in our webinars in the past, we've talked about the difference between drills and exercises and so on. So if this is an area of concern for you, you may want to go back and kind of revisit those.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's important to to think of the corollary to this, that we are preparing people for an active shooter as if it is going to happen. I mean, think about the way that we prepare Marines for combat. We prepare them for combat because Marines probably are going to see combat. But yet when you fly on an airline, they don't make you practice going down the slide because you probably aren't going to crash in your airplane. So we have a level of preparation which is hopefully going to prepare us. Hopefully we're not going to panic in the off chance that something happens. And we have some knowledge and we have some capabilities, and hopefully you read the card and you listen and how do I put on my life jacket? But we aren't going through the paces, and it's not a super realistic drill because your plane probably isn't going to crash. And so can we strike a balance between how are we preparing our educators and our students, because they probably aren't going to be in an active shooter event. So how can we prepare them an amount and a real level of realism that is appropriate? So
says the person who fears flying. Okay, but good analogy.
Flying, I'm scared. I'm claustrophobic. I'm not actually scared of the flying part.
Well, so let's move on. This is one, though, that we haven't talked about very much. You've heard us sermonize on some of these other ones, but the next thing is one that we have talked about, but not to the extent. And this is probably the biggest trend that I think we saw in the fall of 19 was talking about these after school sort of events and the lack of planning and preparation for any crisis event at an after school event, but specifically talking about an active shooter event. We have seen in the fall of 19 pretty dramatic increases in the number of shootings specifically, or gun incidents would maybe a better way to categorize it, at after school events, primarily athletic contests. And the pictures you saw there were from an incident of a football game that occurred where they had an active shooter and the kids were quite literally running around. The band was laying in the stands. The kids were running off the field. Other people were coming on the field. They told the people in the stands to evacuate. Some people evacuated, some people didn't. And so it was a very chaotic situation. The response was really compromised. It was very difficult for them to understand what was going on because there had not been any consideration for that. So let's take a look at some of the specifics. In the fall of 19, there were more than 20 shootings at school sporting events. The one in particular that you just saw, I believe, is the one that took place in Alabama. And that one, there were 9 people that were shot and wounded. Since 2013, and this is a New York Times investigation, 19 people have been killed and more than 100 wounded in shootings that had some sort of connection to a school sporting event, whether it took place in the actual stadium, whether it took place at the rally beforehand, or it took place in the parking lot afterwards, but it had a connection to a school sporting event. And courtesy of the New York Times, you can see where those incidents tend to cluster. Again, oftentimes they're making the correlation, which I don't know that I necessarily agree with, that when you have in states where there is a very high value placed on certain sports, because typically they happen at football and basketball games, where there is very high value that, and where you have strong or high levels of gun ownership, those things tend to coincide into these incidents. I'm not sure that I'm ready to quite go there necessarily yet, but clearly there are concerns related to these sort of sporting events. So the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security makes some recommendations, and we always like to make sure that in our webinars we're not just admiring the problem, but also talking about some ways to address it. And I do think there are some valid concerns here. They talk about the idea of having security screening at every entrance, which is difficult. That's difficult for schools to do, but yet is probably one of the strongest ways to preemptively avoid some of those things within the confines of the stadium. They encourage police to have drills and practices for an active shooter at an event, to have practiced for that and made plans for that. I think we could spread that out and have the school be involved as well, because clearly the administration and the school folks need to have a plan for what we would do, how we would remove kids, how we would protect our students, our band, our athletes, all those people. They talk about metal detectors. And again, we are not big proponents of metal detectors within the confines of a school day. Maybe there is an appropriate place for those used by law enforcement folks. Handheld metal detectors are the ones they talk about the most. Limiting folks to having clear bags. And again, we see all this security that occurs at the professional sports level. And then I think the last one was a very interesting one of getting people away from the perimeter of the event. So you either come into the event, you pay, you come in, you're screened, you go to the event, or you leave. You don't stay in the parking lot. You don't hang out outside the gate. You don't wait around for the players afterwards. You don't wait around in the beginning when the pep rally is happening. And so I think that's a very interesting notion that raises clearly some questions. But it's sort of clearing people away from the opportunity to avoid screening, but still impact the event. So we don't typically, push a lot of online training. And this is just one that is out there that I thought was interesting that's recently been released for training for after-school activities and interscholastic athletes. And I think that's a critical piece that oftentimes we see a disconnect between the person that's in charge of safety for the district, and then there's the person that's in charge of after-school programs, or the person that's in charge of athletics, the athletic director or the coaches. And there is a big disconnect between the planning and preparation and considerations that are happening for what's going on with school safety between 8 and 3, and this almost total lack of discussion and consideration about that after school and before school. So I think the big takeaway here is to make that connection and to look at the things that we plan and prepare for between 8 and 3 and figure out how we would respond, plan, and prepare for those before 8 and after 3. And I think that's probably one of the biggest deficits that most schools will find that they have.
And we'll include the link to this training in the description down below in the video, so you don't need to try and type that.
And then I kind of wanted to sum this up with this Pennsylvania superintendent. They had fatalities that occurred at a football game in the fall. And I think I really am appreciative of his insight on that and his willingness to sort of say this, we train extensively, but we had trained for events that would take place inside the school or on the school grounds. What we had not really trained for was an open venue with patrons, with people from a different school district. And so he really brings to bear that no matter how well trained you feel you are and how much training and time you've dedicated to within the school day, which is awesome.
Or how fortified your buildings are.
Or how much you've spent on security and fortification. When you are in an after-school event with outside community members, people from different school districts, students from different schools, and you're mixing them up in a highly emotional, highly agitated, often aggressive sort of fashion with rivalries and all those sorts of things, that you have a responsibility to plan for how to respond to the events that are going to ensue. And clearly we've talked about active shooter, but we could also talk about all of the other ones that don't have to do with it. A severe weather event, the tornadoes bearing down on the facility. What do I do with all those people? Somebody has a heart attack in the end zone. What do we do about that? So it's not just active shooter, but it's all of those after school times.
So, he talks here about we had trained extensively for this one really narrow understanding of what's going to happen. So we fortified the building against an active shooter, and we've trained extensively against an active shooter. And then the tragedy that befell us was something different. And we've seen that already in January of 2020. I mean, we're not even through the first month of 2020, and we have this. We have a student who was accidentally shot by his friend at school. So again, our really narrowly construed drills and our panic buttons and these things that are really narrowly tailored to this one type of concern, that doesn't help in an incident like this. In a tragedy or an accident like this, an active shooter response drill where I'm run, hide, fight doesn't help in an accidental discharge or something like this.
Let me just point out, it should say 16-year-old. I just want to make sure that we're clear on that.
Yeah.
So, but it's the first fatality in a school shooting, but it's not your textbook typical school shooting. It's was a situation that was very different. And so then I want to kind of transition from that into something else that just happened in the last week or so. And this was a lawsuit that was filed in regards to this 2018 shooting in Great Mills High School in Maryland, where Jalen Wiley was killed by her former boyfriend. And this happened after Parkland. So it did not receive the media attention and did not get as much coverage and concern, perhaps. But I think it's important for us to take a look at the lawsuit in the context of two things. Number one, this happened almost 2 years ago. And so we may say, well, this thing happened and now we moved on. No, not necessarily. The implications of what occurred last for a very long time, not only in the litigation, but also in the recovery process, in the trauma and in all those different aspects. And then I think the other thing that this lawsuit sort of brings to bear that I'm asking you to kind of reflect on is when this chain of behavior that we're going to look at resulted in the death of the student, we can sort of go back and go, wow, yeah, why didn't we do that? But the question is also the chain of behavior we're going to examine is happening right now in many, many, many schools with lots of students who have lots of behavioral and mental health issues who may not ever culminate in a school shooting, but these behaviors are occurring. And so it's not just when it culminates in the death of a student that we need to be concerned. So let's take a quick look at it. And these are allegations from the lawsuit. So please understand, we're just reporting what the allegations are. That the attacker had a significant history of violence, had repeatedly grabbed her, pushed her, yelled at her in the sight of school personnel for more than 2 months before the shooting. That's probably happening in a school today somewhere where there is that sort of dating violence, that sort of harassment and intimidation and bullying that's happening. He made threats to shoot a gun inside the school. We know that happens all the time. Every single day we see reports of that. He had stalked her during school, waited outside her classroom, waited outside her car, texted her friends. Again, that sort of thing is occurring now. And what are schools doing or not doing about it? The family reported the disturbing behavior to the daughter's swim coach, saying they were afraid for her safety. And I think that really struck me when I was reading about this in terms of, was there no other mechanism by which they could report? Was it because the swim coach was a trusted individual or a mentor? Why would we not have reported it in some other fashion? And so we have to reflect on what are the limitations of the ability that people may have to talk about their concerns or to disclose those concerns. And I'm not saying they should or shouldn't have. I'm just saying that's a piece that we need to consider as well. And then I think probably the most damning evidence is that they did not take prevention or take any action, or at least it alleges they did not, they did not discipline the attacker for the behaviors that we just examined, which clearly are unacceptable in pretty much anyone's code of conduct. The use of metal detectors, I'm not going to go down that road because we've talked about that many times. I don't consider that to be relevant. And I don't necessarily see that, a whole bunch of police officers in the building would have made a difference. But it is interesting to look at how this lawsuit is alleging these are things that could have made a difference. Mm-hmm. And whether or not they could have or not is kind of up for debate as well.
But it also speaks again to that notion that even in an incident where you have gun violence, the preparations and the things that we're undertaking in the name of responding to an active shooter wouldn't have made a difference here. It was violence prevention were the things that were really, really needed. Better, more realistic drills where we didn't say it was a drill wouldn't have made a difference in this sort of a targeted attack. Violence prevention is the things that can. So we want to shift a little bit, and I have to skip ahead a couple slides. Hold on. Boop. And so the question that we posed in a previous webinar that we want to pose again, thinking about the fall of 2019, did your school experience an incidence of violence or a crisis event, broadly defined? Again, we're artificially narrowing the scope sometimes to violence only. Did you experience an incident of violence or a crisis event that didn't involve a gun? We talked about some research that some of our grad students piloted where they were sent out a survey and they had all of these different types of crisis events, some of which were violence, some of which were natural hazards, infrastructure concerns, and they sent it out to a whole bunch of administrators and they were asking, in the last year, did your school have a crisis event or some type of violence that didn't involve a gun? And in their research, what they found was all of the respondents had at least one type of crisis event that they responded, yep, this happened in my school last year, and 0 of their respondents had an active shooter event or an incident of violence involving a gun in their school. So again,
and in the totality, between the very small sample set, almost all of the crisis events were ticked by somebody except for the shooting.
Yeah. And so again, that question of what are we doing about the other more likely safety concerns that school face? And we talk about these a little bit, and in some of our other webinars and our other podcasts, we've talked about real world examples of these. Obviously, natural hazards. We talked in a recent podcast about the jet fuel that was dumped over a school. I don't know if you would consider that a natural hazard or a technological hazard, but it wasn't violence. It wasn't a school shooting, and that school had to deal with that crisis event. Obviously, we always are concerned about bullying, harassment, and physical attacks, and especially things that happen where there's a lack of adult supervision. You were telling me about a specific case where there's cell phone video.
And it's a very typical. It's a very classic case of where somebody set this up. We're gonna video you as you attack this kid, and it's it's a large kid and a smaller kid who punches him in the back of the head, and the kid tries to fight back, but he's still clutching his notebook. And it's a very typical, having spent most of my life with middle schoolers, it's a very typical middle school fight situation of where the kids are essentially going, someone stop us because we don't really want to fight, but we are fighting. And you added that additional component of social media where we're taking a video of it and now we're putting it on social media, and where I'm deliberately staging this attack so that I can expose this kid. And it really pulls together a lot of the things that are still ongoing concerns in terms of the bullying, the harassment, the physical attack. And all of it took place in a locker room because there wasn't adequate supervision. Mm-hmm. And it wouldn't have had to have been a locker room. It could have been the hallway outside the cafeteria. It could have been the bus stop while they're waiting for the bus after school. So there's all of those different things that are much more likely safety concerns that are happening every single day in our schools and just aren't being addressed.
So we want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on this last one here of problems in the school bus, which I feel like we talk about a lot on the podcast.
We've been really going after the school bus, and I apologize in advance, but it's really an uptick that we're seeing. Lots of issues with impaired or incompetent school bus drivers. And it's not just impaired, but it's folks who are subcontractors, who are subs, who are independent contractors, who are driving a school bus, but don't necessarily understand kids or understand what they're supposed to be doing. Combine then with other people on the road, impaired, distracted, incompetent drivers. Clearly, we've seen an uptick in both of those things. There are still ongoing financial constraints for more and more where we're consolidating routes, we're having fewer stops, we're putting more different age kids together in buses. And then as a result, perhaps, there's an increase in the number of parent drivers. So I'm picking up my kid instead of having them take the bus, or picking them up instead of having them walk. And so then we end up with lots of interactions or intersections between the parent, the school bus, the traffic, the what's happening after school. And so that becomes a concern as well. So I think all those things have sort of combined to give us this uptick in bus accidents and some really kind of extreme sort of situations. And I want to talk about two of them in particular because they just happened last week. The one happens all the time and is probably the most preventable of all. 5-year-old falls asleep on the bus, which happens all the time. He wakes up in the bus garage and then walks home on a busy highway. And this is in Michigan during the winter. So the 5-year-old is now walking down the side of the road, and people call the police come, pick him up. Luckily, he knows his address. They take him home. All of which completely preventable if we just walk to the back of the bus and look before we get off. Again, this is a requirement in most states. So some of this stuff is just where we're not following the policies and procedures that are required of us because we think, well, I'm in a hurry, or this doesn't matter that much. And then here's the result. And it happens a great deal. The other one I think is probably just as troubling. This one was in West Virginia.
More troubling, but
I'm sorry?
I would say more troubling, but
well, I don't know. A 5-year-old walking by himself down the highway is pretty troubling. In West Virginia, the school bus driver is charged with a DUI. He collides with 3 other vehicles, and then the bus catches fire. There's kids on the bus. It's 8:02 a.m. And we end up in a situation where we have an impaired driver. And this is, unfortunately, we're seeing this more and more. And again, this is not a knock on drivers, and I know we feel like we're talking about them all the time, but we have to acknowledge that the folks that are doing a good job driving a school bus need to be supported and retained and kept as a valuable part of our organization. And we also need to weed out and be very much concerned with the ones that are more and more impacting kids negatively based on their incompetence or their issues.
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to need to hold this question for next time because we are sort of at the end of our time here. And we'll sort of close with this question that we sort of always examine, which is where do we go from here? And hopefully you feel like that there is so much that we can do. And we didn't dive a lot today into sort of like real nitty gritty, how do we solve this, but more asking you to consider some of these concerns and consider some of the things that we're seeing. And so, is there someone that you wish had seen this webinar? Folks who are joining us live, you have a colleague that you wish had seen this, you can take them to eschoolsafety.org/webinar. This webinar is archived there. All of our previous webinars are archived there. So if you are looking for a deeper dive into stuff that we had indicated that we talked about earlier, you can find all of that there. All of our free online professional development is available also on our website, eschoolsafety.org/onlinepd. We have all the webinars like this. We have our live streams of our podcast. So you can either watch those live on YouTube, or you can watch them archived on YouTube, or you can listen to them as podcasts if you are listening to podcasts as you're doing other things, and you can find them wherever you normally get podcasts, on Google, on Apple,
How about
on Stitcher.
A teaser for our next podcast where we'll talk about why haven't the number of incidents and threats, and we'll even bring John Dewey into it.
Who you may have seen if you were watching it real quick as I skipped through. If you also want to connect with us, some of those are more active ways. A more passive way is you can pause this, scan that QR code, or head to this shortened URL, and you can sign up for our school safety newsletter. And we will send stuff directly into your inbox once a month. We won't inundate you. We are not Zappos and all the people who send me stuff all the time. Also, you can also check out our book that we wrote that was published by ASCD, which, if you're unfamiliar with us and the work that we do, that's a really good introduction. It is a practitioner-based volume. It is not too much highfalutin theoretical discussion. It's, I am dealing with these problems in my school as an educator, as an educational leader. what can we do about them? How can I start to tackle and address some of these concerns? And also the book, you'll see it in the subtitle there, how to prepare for and respond to. So we're doing preparation and response, and all hazards, school violence, natural disasters, other hazards. So we are hopefully in the book walking the walk of prevention and response, violence, and all hazards approach. Also, if you are looking for any other way to connect with us, you can always email us directly. You can check us out on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter, or really anything that you're looking for. It's probably best to just head directly to our website. You have anything else you want to add?
Nope. We'll see you next time. We have a continual series of webinars. So we hope that you will join us for webinar number 6. And if you miss us between now and that next month, come back for the podcast next week.
All right. Thanks. Bye.